Hello everyone. More than a month has passed since Russia launched its full-blown invasion of Ukraine. Russian invaders have already committed multiple war crimes, and the genocidal intentions of the current Russian leadership towards the Ukrainian nation are becoming increasingly obvious. Although massively demoralized and often and understandably turning arms against each other, Russian invaders do not hesitate to bomb and shell any building they can reach. No matter if it's a residential building, a hospital, a local council, a kindergarten, an art museum, a theater, they destroy everything. They kill indiscriminately. It sometimes feels that they have adopted the United Nations definition of genocide as literally their program. Killing members of the group. Check. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group. Check. Preventing births within the group. Check. And now they've started kidnapping children and moving them to Russia, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Check. In order to distract Western attention from the immense humanitarian catastrophe caused by the invasion, Russia is using various smokes and mirrors techniques. One of those deceptive practices is Moscow's focus on the Azov regiment, that is falsely described by the Kremlin and pro-Kremlin media as a fascist or neo-Nazi militia or battalion. All these descriptions are wrong, and today I'm going to talk about Azov and explain the reasons behind the information attacks against this military unit that plays an important role in resisting the Russian genocidal invasion. In February 2014, Ukrainian pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia after his regime had killed more than 100 of protesters. Russia took advantage of the political turmoil in Ukraine and the hesitancy of Western leadership. It illegally annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. Ukraine could hardly defend itself. Years of corrupt pro-Russian leadership almost destroyed Ukrainian armed forces. And many in the Ukrainian military were simply not psychologically ready to offer armed response to those who were their neighbors. Malicious Russian leaders were obviously aware of those weaknesses of the Ukrainian society and exploited them to the maximum. What Moscow was not aware of was the strength of Ukrainian volunteer networks. Those networks were built during the Maidan Revolution, and following the invasion of Ukraine, they formed first resistance groups that were later transformed into volunteer battalions. Azov was formed as a volunteer police battalion in May 2014. The original battalion consisted mostly of football hooligans and members of the Ukrainian far-right movement, and it was the far-right organization Patriot of Ukraine that was in charge of the original battalion. Like many of my colleagues, I was extremely skeptical and critical of the original battalion for several reasons. I will give you 4 of them. First, the Patriot of Ukraine was one of the most racist and anti-Semitic groups in Ukraine. Its members were involved in spreading far-right propaganda and occasional political and criminal violence. It was almost impossible to trust those people, especially given their anti-democratic and anti-establishment rhetoric. Second, the leadership of the Patriot of Ukraine, including the first commander of Azov, did not participate in the Ukrainian revolution, as they were all imprisoned on different charges. They were released, together with other people who were considered to be political prisoners of the pro-Russian regime, after Yanukovych fled to Russia. That meant that the leaders of the Patriot of Ukraine did not have an opportunity to show their worth during the most dramatic periods of the Ukrainian revolution, and we didn't know what to expect of them. Third, the far-right imagery of the original Azov battalion played into the hands of the Russian propaganda that pictured the Ukrainian revolution as a fascist coup and all volunteer battalions as neo-Nazis. Fourth, several people who were directly involved in the formation of the battalion had a very dubious history of cooperating not only with pro-Russian forces in Ukraine, but also with Russian spin doctors. Moreover, neither Azov nor other volunteer units did proper screening of volunteers, some of whom came from Russia. All that created a huge security risk of Russian operatives seizing control of Azov and turning it into an anti-Ukrainian force. To sum up these points, we had well-justified concerns about Azov and did not trust it. Nobody doubted the fact that at that time Ukraine needed volunteers of any social or political background. Remember, at that time the Ukrainian army was almost non-existent. If you are drowning, you will unlikely be asking about social attitudes or political convictions of those willing to save you. But what if they're willing to save you just to kill you in a different manner? With time, some of our concerns disappeared. In June 2014, Azov played a very important role in liberating the Ukrainian city of Mariupol from pro-Russian forces. And that proved not only Azov's combat effectiveness, but also their truly pro-Ukrainian positions. Because of its fighting abilities, Azov started to attract more volunteers, and many of them had no political background at all. In autumn 2014, Azov was transformed into a regiment and enrolled into the National Guard of Ukraine, which is part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. That created a hierarchical vertical to ensure, as much as possible, that Azov would remain loyal to the Ukrainian state. And also, within a few months after the creation of the Azov battalion, people who had history of these dubious links to Russian and pro-Russian stakeholders moved away from the battalion. And while several Russian agents infiltrated Azov, they were never able to exert any serious impact on its service. The remaining major concern was the political aspect of the regiment. But because of the domestic and international criticism of the far-right background of the leadership of the original battalion, Azov started the process of depoliticization. In 2015, a number of former fighters of Azov formed an NGO, Azov Civil Corps, that was transformed into a party called National Corps in 2016. Far-right figures departed from the command of Azov and became engaged in the party building. They hoped that the popular support for defenders of Ukraine would somehow translate into political success and electoral victories. So at that time, the separation of the National Corps from Azov was not yet complete. They had to keep the link, if only symbolical, between the defenders of the motherland, who enjoyed respect from the Ukrainian society, and the political project. But already then it was quite clear that the regiment followed orders of Ukraine's interior ministry, while the National Corps had no power over the military unit. The party's hopes to benefit from Azov's military valor were all in vain. In public opinion polls, figures for the National Corps and all other Ukrainian far-right parties were devastating. The National Corps kept on referring to Azov as its affiliated organization, and naive Western journalists and experts took all that bluster at face value, instead of realizing that Azov was not a political organization, and that its command structure was completely separate from the National Corps. By the time of the Ukrainian parliamentary elections in 2019, it became evident that no far-right party would make it to the parliament. Out of despair, Ukrainian far-right parties decided to team up and join forces to compete in the parliamentary elections. But their united list that included members of the National Corps, Freedom Party, Right Sect and a few minor far-right organizations received just over 2% of the vote and failed to get them elected into the parliament. The electoral failure of the Ukrainian far-right can be explained by the fact that they cannot offer anything viable to the Ukrainian state and society. The only time when the Ukrainian far-right was relatively successful in the elections was in 2012, when the Freedom Party received 10.5% of the vote. I want to stress, they secured seats in the Ukrainian parliament not because of their far-right program, but because of their radical criticism of the Kremlin and its agents in Ukraine. After the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the Ukrainian far-right lost its monopoly on radical criticism of Russia, and with that, they essentially lost all the electoral appeal that they had. The Ukrainian far-right in general fell into irrelevance, and the National Corps and groups around it suffered an identity crisis. They tried to experiment with different ideological narratives, largely borrowed from Western far-right discourses, but none of them really worked outside of very, very small groups. And ironically, when the Western far-right tried to exploit the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-2021 and to promote their anti-government conspiracy theories, the National Corps ran an information campaign on how to avoid getting infected, totally in line with the mainstream domestic and international guidelines on the new coronavirus. The National Corps still refers to its symbolical link to the Azov regiment, but it's rather political propaganda of the National Corps than a reality. Azov today is a highly professional special operations detachment. To stress, not a political organization, not a militia, not a far-right battalion, a special operations detachment. It is still formally subordinated to the National Guard of Ukraine's Interior Ministry, but in reality it now largely coordinates its activities with the armed forces. So we can expect that Azov will move under the command of Ukraine's Defense Ministry. Azov consists predominantly of Ukrainian citizens of various ethnic backgrounds. Among Azov's fighters there are ethnic Ukrainians, Russians, Crimean Tatars, Georgians, Belarusians, Greeks, Jews. But whatever their ethnic background, they are all Ukrainian patriots who are risking and sacrificing their lives for Ukraine's sovereignty, freedom and democracy. The Kremlin, pro-Kremlin and far-left media picture Azov as haters of Russian speakers. But not only do Azov fighters speak mostly Russian among themselves, Actually, they on average speak better Russian than Russian invaders. Remember this the next time you will hear blatant Kremlin lies that Azov is allegedly fighting against Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. One may ask, why has Azov become one of the main targets of lies, fabrications and falsehoods produced by the Kremlin and pro-Kremlin propaganda? An obvious explanation is that the attack on Azov is part of the Kremlin's disinformation narrative on Nazis in Ukraine. A less obvious but probably more important explanation is linked to the place where Azov has been stationed since 2014. This is the Ukrainian city of Mariupol and the area around it. Back in 2014, if you remember, Azov greatly contributed to the liberation of Mariupol from the pro-Russian henchmen. Mariupol is not yet another Ukrainian city. If you look at the map of Ukraine, you will see that Mariupol is the largest and most important city located in the area that is considered to be a potential land bridge from Russia to annex Crimea. Because of the logistical troubles that Russia has with supplying Crimea with water, electricity and other resources, it is crucial for Russia to occupy territories of that potential land bridge. But Mariupol stands in the way, and Azov stands in the way. The entire regiment is now in Mariupol. Through its agents in Ukraine and elsewhere, Moscow has been trying really hard to destroy Azov or at the very least weaken its military capabilities. Especially in NATO member states, there was a massive effort to prevent Azov fighters from receiving military training from Ukraine's Western allies, as well as to prevent Azov from obtaining advanced weapons and hardware. The Kremlin's efforts have been to a certain extent successful. And today the Azov regiment that defends Mariupol, completely surrounded by the Russian invaders, has neither Javelin anti-tank systems nor Bayraktar drones that would have helped them to defend the city and save thousands of lives of residents of Mariupol. All thanks to those people, Western pro-Russian politicians, pseudo-journalists, fake experts, ignorant consultants who indirectly or directly lobbied against training Azov and equipping it with advanced weapons. Make no mistake, they all share responsibility for the humanitarian catastrophe in Mariupol. Of course, we can say that the Westerners obsessed with the alleged neo-Nazi threat of Azov are all victims of dysmetropsia, an inability to judge an object's size. In one of my favorite British sitcoms, Father Ted, the main character tried to explain to his less smart colleague, Father Dougal Maguire, the difference in size between toy cows and the real cows. These are small ones, he said, but the ones out there are far away. Father Ted was unsuccessful, because Father Dougal had dysmetropsia and frankly was an idiot. The same can be said about Western commentators who see no difference between the alleged far-right threat of Azov and Russian genocidal invasion of Ukraine. But I think that dysmetropsia cannot explain everything, and I would rather talk about Western moral procrastination. Unfortunately, we all know what procrastination is. It is about voluntarily distracting ourselves with insignificant activities from performing really important tasks. Moral procrastination is about giving preference to small exciting things instead of dealing with difficult issues that actually matter. Let me show you something. This is Mariupol, a predominantly Russian-speaking home of Ukrainians, Russians, Greeks, Jews, Armenians. Or it used to be their home, before the Russian invaders came. The invaders have already killed thousands of people there, and they're killing them right now, as I speak. Many of the dead are lying unburied on the streets of Mariupol, because every time their relatives and friends try to pick them up, to bury them, Russian invaders shoot at them. If people are lucky to pick them up, they usually have to bury them in mass graves. And those residents of Mariupol who still survive are forced to hide in the basements, where they starve and freeze and die. This chilling horror is psychologically hard to process, but we are morally obliged to be aware of this, that this is happening in Europe, right around the corner. And our human nature pushes us to do something to stop Russian inhuman war crimes. But there are many in the West who, instead of even starting to comprehend the horrendous brutality of Russia's war against Ukraine, prefer to distract themselves with inquiries whether Azov fighters have any politically incorrect tattoos or t-shirts. Much more exciting, of course, than to stand up to the Russian genocidal invasion. This moral procrastination needs to be met with disdain and contempt. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky recently awarded the country's highest award, the Hero of Ukraine, to Azov commander Denis Prokopenko for Azov's selfless epic struggle against superior numbers of the Russian enemy forces. Well deserved. But in Mariupol, Azov defends not only the living and the wounded, but also the dead. Not only do they deserve to be properly buried, they are also silent witnesses to Russian war crimes. As we well know, Russian invaders are equipped with mobile crematoriums that they use to destroy evidence of their villainy. And in Mariupol, Azov is now defending not only the freedom of the living, but also the dignity of the dead.